She didn't plan to buy children that Tuesday morning, but when the auctioneer's hammer froze midair and the smallest boy whispered her dead husband's name through burlap sacking, Sarah Broken Arrow knew some debts follow you beyond the grave. 3 orphans, $2, no names, no guarantees, the red-faced man had bellowed, but his voice cracked when those tiny lips formed the word Joshua. The crowd's murmur died to deathly silence. A woman gasped. The auctioneer's gavel clattered to the wooden platform. Sarah's weathered hands found her wedding ring, twisting the silver band until her knuckle turned white. 3 years of talking to Joshua's headstone, and now this impossible whisper from a child who'd never known him. "Ma'am?" The auctioneer's voice shook. "You bidding or not?" Her trembling fingers counted 2 precious dollars, her egg money, her only salvation from the bank's foreclosure notice. But how could a 6-year-old boy know her husband's name when Joshua had been buried before any of these children could speak? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years ago, Sarah Broken Arrow had been a different woman. She'd worn her Cherokee heritage like a quiet strength, her marriage to Joshua Whitman a bridge between 2 worlds in the harsh territory of Black Mesa, New Mexico. Back then, their 40-acre homestead had buzzed with hope, Joshua's laughter echoing from the barn, her hands busy preparing for the children they'd dreamed of raising together. The miscarriages had come like winter storms, sudden, devastating, leaving her heart as barren as the high desert around them. 4 times she'd felt life quicken within her. 4 times she'd buried those dreams in the red earth beside their adobe house. Joshua would hold her through those dark nights, whispering promises that next time would be different, that God had plans for their family. Then the railroad came to Black Mesa, bringing progress and peril in equal measure. Joshua, skilled with dynamite from his mining days, took work blasting pathways through the mesa's stubborn rock. "Good money," he'd said, "enough to expand the house, maybe adopt children if the good Lord wouldn't bless them naturally." The explosion that killed him hadn't been an accident. Sarah knew that much from the way the railroad supervisors avoided her eyes at the funeral, the way they'd offered her money to sell the homestead and relocate somewhere more suitable for a woman alone. Now, at 42, Sarah lived like a ghost, haunting her own life. Each morning brought the same ritual, feeding the 6 chickens that somehow survived her grief, tending a vegetable garden that grew smaller each season, and walking the 1/4 mile to Joshua's grave beneath the twisted pinyon tree. She'd talk to him there, sharing the day's small victories and larger defeats, always ending with the same desperate prayer. "Send me someone to love, Joshua. Send me a reason to keep breathing." The townspeople of Black Mesa had long since stopped expecting normal behavior from the Indian widow who talks to ghosts. The Mexican families understood. Maria Santos often crossed herself when Sarah passed, not from fear, but from recognition of profound loss. The Chinese railroad workers nodded respectfully, their own grief for distant families reflected in her hollow eyes. But the Anglo settlers whispered about madness, about savage blood and pagan spirits. Her finances balanced on a knife's edge. The mortgage payment, $15 monthly, consumed most of her egg money, and the coin she earned doing laundry for the railroad workers. $2 represented groceries for a week, or lamp oil for the dark winter months, or, as today had proven, the price of 3 small lives hanging in the balance. The homestead itself bore witness to her decline. Paint peeled from the shutters Joshua had hung with such pride. The vegetable garden, once abundant with corn and beans, now struggled to produce enough to feed one lonely woman. The barn where he'd planned to house livestock stood empty except for memories and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Yet something deeper had stirred within Sarah when that child's voice spoke Joshua's name. For the first time in 3 years, she'd felt the flutter of purpose, the the whisper of destiny calling her towards something larger than her own carefully cultivated sorrow. The ride home stretched like eternity. Sarah's wagon creaked through the desert heat while three small figures huddled in the bed behind her, silent as stones. She'd paid her $2 to stunned murmurs from the crowd, then watched the auctioneer cut the ropes binding the burlap sacks with hands that trembled almost as much as her own. The oldest boy, maybe 12, with skin the color of desert sand and eyes too old for his face, had stepped protectively in front of the others the moment his bonds were cut. The middle child, perhaps 9, bore the fading purple of old bruises on his thin arms and kept his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. But it was the smallest one who haunted her thoughts, the boy whose impossible whisper had changed everything. 6 years old at most, with dark hair that caught copper highlights in the sun and eyes that seemed to see through the very fabric of the world. "Ma'am," the oldest boy had said when the auctioneer released them, his voice carefully controlled, "what you fixin' to do with us?" Sarah had looked into those wary eyes and seen herself reflected, abandoned, afraid, expecting the worst from a world that had already taken everything. "Take you home," she'd answered simply. Now, as the adobe walls of her homestead came into view, Sarah wondered what madness had possessed her. She had barely enough food for herself, no extra blankets, no children's clothes. The boys probably expected to sleep in the barn, if they were lucky enough to avoid being chained again. She pulled the wagon to a stop beside the kitchen door and climbed down slowly, her joints protesting the long day. "Come on then," she said, turning to face her new reality. The boys descended from the wagon like wild animals emerging from a trap, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Their clothes, what remained of them, hung in tatters. Dirt caked their skin, and she could count ribs through the tears in their shirts. "When did you last eat?" Sarah asked gently. The oldest boy, she needed names, but those could wait, straightened his shoulders. "We don't need much, ma'am. Just somewhere to sleep. We can work for our keep." The words broke her heart. Children this young shouldn't know the language of survival, shouldn't speak of earning their place in the world through labor alone. "You need food first, then baths, then we'll worry about work." Sarah headed toward the kitchen, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Come inside." The boys exchanged glances but followed her through the door into the cool adobe interior. Sarah's kitchen had seen better days. The wooden table bore knife marks from years of use, and the cast iron stove dominated one wall like a patient beast. But it was clean, and it smelled of cornbread and coffee rather than fear. She moved to the cupboard, taking inventory. Enough beans for a decent meal, cornmeal for bread, eggs from this morning's gathering. As she worked, she felt 3 pairs of eyes tracking her every movement. "What's your names?" she asked while stoking the fire in the stove. The oldest boy answered first. "They call me Little Wolf, ma'am. This here's Running Bear," he indicated the middle boy, "and the little one's Spirit Walker." Sarah paused in her stirring. "Those your real names, or the ones someone gave you?" "Real enough," Little Wolf replied, but something in his tone suggested layers of story she wasn't ready to hear. As beans bubbled in the pot and cornbread baked in the oven, Sarah prepared a basin of warm water and laid out one of Joshua's old shirts, scissors in hand to cut it down to size. The boys watched these preparations with growing confusion. "You fixin' to sell us clean?" Running Bear spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fixin' to give you a bath because you're family now, and family takes care of each other." The words surprised Sarah even as she spoke them, but they felt true in a way nothing had for 3 years. Spirit Walker, the boy who'd whispered Joshua's name, approached the basin of water and dipped one finger tentatively into the warmth. "The tall man said you'd have warm water," he murmured, so quietly Sarah almost missed it. Her hands stilled on the towel she'd been folding. "What tall man, honey?" The child looked up at her with eyes that held depths no 6-year-old should possess. The one with sad eyes who misses you. He said to find the woman with broken arrows in her heart, and she'd make the water warm again. The towel slipped from Sarah's numb fingers. No one called her Broken Arrow except Joshua. It had been his pet name for her, born from a story about her Cherokee great-grandmother and spoken only in their most private moments. Little Wolf stepped closer to his youngest companion, protective instincts flaring. "He gets confused sometimes, ma'am. Don't mean nothing by it." But Sarah knelt before Spirit Walker, studying his earnest face. "This tall man, what else did he tell you?" "Said you've been talking to stones when you should be talking to children. Said he can't rest proper until you stop crying every night." The boy's small hand reached out to touch her cheek where tears had begun to fall. "Said to tell you the debts ain't yours to carry no more." 3 weeks had passed since Sarah brought the boys home, and Black Mesa buzzed with gossip like a disturbed hornet's nest. The routine they'd built felt fragile as spun glass. Morning chores, simple lessons around the kitchen table, evening stories by lamplight. But it was theirs. Little Wolf had appointed himself guardian of the household, rising before dawn to feed the chickens and check the fence posts. Running Bear revealed an artist's soul, carving small animals from scraps of wood while humming melodies in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Spirit Walker followed her everywhere, his small hand often slipping into hers as he shared fragments of conversations with the tall man that left Sarah's heart aching with impossible hope. The transformation in all 3 boys amazed her. Little Wolf's defiance had softened into protective leadership. Running Bear spoke in full sentences now, describing the colors he saw in sunset clouds and the stories he found in weathered rock formations. Spirit Walker had begun sleeping through the night without the screaming terrors that had marked their first week together. But peace in Black Mesa was a luxury Sarah couldn't afford to trust. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Reverend Matthias Coldwater, a tall, gaunt man with eyes like winter sky and a smile that never quite reached them. He rode up to the homestead in a black buggy pulled by 2 perfectly matched sorrel horses, his dark coat immaculate despite the desert dust. Sarah watched him approach from her kitchen window, instinctively moving to place herself between the stranger and the boys. Little Wolf appeared at her elbow, tension radiating from his young frame. "You know him?" she asked quietly. "Know the type," Little Wolf replied, his hand moving to the wooden knife handle at his belt, a tool Sarah had given him for whittling but which he clearly viewed as something more. Reverend Coldwater's knock came sharp and authoritative against the adobe walls. Sarah opened the door to find him studying her with an expression that managed to convey both pity and disapproval. "Mrs. Whitman, I presume?" His voice carried the crisp diction of Eastern education. "I am Reverend Matthias Coldwater, representing the Bureau of Indian Affairs Educational Initiatives. I've come regarding the 3 Indian children currently in your custody." Sarah's spine straightened. "They're my sons now, legally adopted." The Reverend's smile grew sharper. "I'm afraid that's where we encounter our first difficulty." He produced a leather portfolio from his coat withdrawing official-looking documents. "These children are wards of the federal government designated for placement in appropriate educational facilities. Your transaction at the livestock auction carries no legal weight." "Those papers could say anything," Sarah replied, though her heart had begun a rapid, fearful rhythm. "I can't read government language." "Perhaps Dr. Henley might assist you?" Coldwater suggested smoothly. "I understand he's quite literate, though I should mention that harboring federal wards without proper authorization carries significant penalties." Behind Sarah, she heard the soft scuff of bare feet on adobe floors as the boys positioned themselves to listen. Spirit Walker's small hand found the back of her skirt, gripping the fabric with desperate fingers. "What kind of penalties?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Prison, naturally, forfeiture of property." And the children would still be removed to proper facilities. The Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania has an excellent program for civilizing Indian youth. "Kill the Indian, save the man," as Captain Pratt so eloquently states. The casual cruelty in his tone made Sarah's Cherokee blood boil. "These boys have names, Reverend. They're not savages to be civilized." "Names?" Coldwater chuckled, a sound like breaking glass. "Little Wolf, Running Bear, Spirit Walker, these are the appellations of heathens, Mrs. Whitman. At Carlisle they'll receive proper Christian names. David, Michael, Timothy, perhaps. They'll learn trades, discipline, the value of honest labor." "They're learning those things here, under the guidance of a woman?" The Reverend's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "A woman who, by all accounts, speaks to the dead and practices savage rituals. Hardly appropriate guardianship for impressionable young minds." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The gossip mill had been busier than she'd realized. "I have witnesses," Coldwater continued pleasantly, "to your daily visits to your husband's grave, the conversations you hold there. Some might call it grief. Others might suggest something more disturbing." From behind her came a small, clear voice. "She talks to Papa because he talks back." Spirit Walker stepped around Sarah's skirt to face the Reverend directly, his 6-year-old frame trembling but determined. "He says, you're the one with darkness in your heart, says you hurt children and call it God's work." The Reverend's pleasant expression cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Interesting. The child exhibits signs of demonic influence, speaking with spirits, claiming supernatural knowledge. All the more reason for immediate intervention." "He's not possessed," Sarah snapped. "He's gifted." "Gifted?" Coldwater's laugh was sharp as broken pottery. "Mrs. "Whitman, this child is clearly disturbed, possibly dangerous. The other two show signs of refusing to assimilate, maintaining heathen names, practicing savage customs. They require firm correction, Christian discipline." Little Wolf stepped forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Spirit Walker. "We ain't going nowhere with you, preacher man." "You misunderstand your situation, boy." Coldwater's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "You have no choice in this matter. You are government property to be disposed of as the government sees fit." The casual dehumanization hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't children to Coldwater. They were livestock to be branded and shipped to market. "How long?" she asked quietly. "I beg your pardon?" "How long do I have before you come back with the law?" Coldwater smiled, the expression transforming his austere features into something genuinely frightening. "Such a practical question. 7 days, Mrs. Whitman. 7 days to make peace with the inevitable. After that, I return with federal marshals and proper transport. The children will be removed and you, well, that depends on how cooperative you choose to be." He gathered his papers with theatrical precision, tipping his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Do give my proposal due consideration. The children's futures and your own hang in the balance." As his buggy disappeared into the desert heat, Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet. 7 days to save her boys. 7 days to fight the entire weight of federal law and religious righteousness. 7 days to prove that love could triumph over a system designed to tear families apart. But first, she needed to learn exactly what those papers said, and whether Dr. Henley's friendship ran deep enough to risk helping a woman the government now considered a criminal. The 7 days that followed Reverend Coldwater's visit transformed Sarah's quiet homestead into a fortress of determination and desperate love. She'd ridden into town that very afternoon, the boys hidden in the mesa caves Little Wolf had discovered during their explorations, and found Dr. Heinrich Henley hunched over his medical texts in the cramped office behind the barber shop. The old German immigrant had been Joshua's closest friend, a man whose own losses, a wife and daughter to cholera during the Atlantic crossing, had taught him to recognize genuine grief from theatrical mourning. When Sarah spread Coldwater's documents across his scarred wooden desk, his weathered face had grown grave. "Mein Gott," he'd whispered, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "These papers, they are real, Sarah. Federal authority to collect displaced Indian miners for educational placement." His accent thickened with emotion. "But there is something here that stinks like rotten meat." The documents bore official seals, but Dr. Henley's careful examination revealed subtle irregularities, dates that didn't align, signatures that looked too similar, authorization numbers that followed no logical sequence. Someone had crafted these papers with skill but not perfection. "Why would anyone forge federal documents?" Sarah had asked. Dr. Henley had removed his spectacles, cleaning them with hands that trembled slightly. Perhaps the same reason someone might arrange a convenient mining accident for a man who asked too many questions about where orphaned children disappear to. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Joshua's death, which she'd mourned as cruel fate, might have been calculated murder. The railroad work, the explosion, the supervisor's nervous generosity afterward, pieces of a puzzle she'd been too grief-stricken to assemble. That evening she'd gathered the boys around the kitchen table for a conversation that would change everything. Little Wolf sat straight-backed and alert, already sensing the gravity of the moment. Running Bear carved absently at a piece of pine, his artistic hands creating delicate feathers that seemed to move in the lamplight. Spirit Walker perched beside Sarah, his small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden surface as if reading messages invisible to adult eyes. "We got troubles coming," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "That preacher man, he's not what he seems, and those papers he showed might not be real, but real or not, he's got power behind him, and he aims to take you boys away from me." Little Wolf's knife stilled against the wood he'd been carving. "To that school place, the one where they cut children's hair and beat them for speaking their names?" Sarah nodded grimly. Stories of the Carlisle Industrial School had reached even Black Mesa, tales of children who arrived as proud tribal members and emerged years later as broken ghosts, forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their cultural traditions. "But here's what I think," Sarah continued, reaching across to cover Little Wolf's hand with her own. "I think Joshua was involved in something before he died, something to help children like you, and I think that preacher killed him for it." Spirit Walker's head snapped up, his dark eyes focusing with an intensity that always unnerved adults who didn't know him. "Papa says the black coat man has blood on his hands, says there's a place where the children go that ain't no school." The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the warmth from the stove. Running Bear set down his carving, giving Spirit Walker his full attention. "What kind of place?" Sarah asked gently. "Dark place. Underground. Children work until they die, and no one comes looking because everyone thinks they're getting educated." Spirit Walker's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone children used for nightmares that had become real. "Papa says to look in the old mine shaft behind the mesa. Says there's proof hidden where only family would think to look." Sarah's heart raced. Joshua had worked those mines before the railroad job. If he'd hidden evidence of some conspiracy, it would be somewhere only she might think to search. "We'll look tomorrow," she decided. "But tonight, we plan, because in 6 days that man comes back with help and we need to be ready." The next morning brought unexpected allies. Maria Santos arrived at dawn with her 3 children and a wagon loaded with supplies. The Mexican widow's weathered face was set with determination that brooked no argument. "Mi hermana," she said, embracing Sarah with fierce affection. "The whole town talks about the government man and his threats. And some say you should give up the boys, save yourself trouble. Others—" She gestured toward the trail where more wagons approached through the morning mist. Wang Wei emerged from the second wagon, his normally placid expression tight with controlled anger. Behind him came Tom Yazzie, a Navajo man who traded horses in Black Mesa and had been watching the situation with quiet interest. The third wagon held the Kellys, Irish immigrants who'd found their own children threatened by zealous reformers seeking to place Catholic orphans in Protestant institutions. "Seems we all got reasons to distrust government men who steal children," Tom Yazzie said, his voice carrying the weight of generations who'd watched their young ones marched away to distant schools. Wang Wei nodded gravely. "In China, we say, when the small fish band together, even the large fish must take notice. Perhaps it is time for the small fish of Black Mesa to show their teeth." That afternoon, while the adults planned strategy and shared intelligence about Coldwater's movements, Sarah and the boys made their way to the abandoned mine behind the mesa. The shaft had been sealed after a collapse 2 years earlier, but Joshua's engineering knowledge had always found ways around official barriers. Little Wolf led them to a concealed entrance, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. "Found this while we were exploring," he explained. "Goes deep, but there's a chamber about 50 yards in that stays dry." The journey through the narrow passage tested Sarah's nerves, but her determination outweighed her fear. The chamber Little Wolf had described opened into a natural cavern where Joshua had clearly spent considerable time. A camp chair sat beside a makeshift table, papers scattered across its surface and protected from moisture by an oilcloth covering. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the cloth and found Joshua's careful handwriting documenting a horror beyond her imagination. Names, dates, numbers, a ledger of children purchased at auctions like livestock and shipped not to educational institutions but to illegal mining operations throughout the territory. Boys as young as 8 working in conditions that killed adults, girls sold into domestic slavery or worse. At the center of it all was Reverend Matthias Coldwater, who used his religious authority to legitimize the trafficking while partnering with corrupt federal officials to provide documentation. The Carlisle Industrial School existed and did take some children, but dozens more disappeared into a network of labor camps and private exploitation that generated enormous profits for its operators. "Papa knew," Spirit Walker whispered, his small fingers touching the papers as if they burned. "He tried to save as many as he could, but the black coat man found out." A separate folder contained maps marking the locations of hidden camps, routes used to transport children, and most damning of all, correspondence between Coldwater and territorial officials planning the systematic removal of native children from families deemed unsuitable for guardianship. Running Bear picked up a photograph that had fallen from the stack of papers. It showed a group of children standing before a mine entrance, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. "My sister," he said quietly, pointing to a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. "She was taken 2 years ago. They said she went to school in California." Sarah's throat tightened with rage and heartbreak. How many families had been torn apart by this monstrous enterprise? How many children had died in darkness while their parents believed them safe in classrooms? But Joshua's final entries offered hope alongside horror. He'd been part of an underground network, what he called the Children's Railroad, that had successfully hidden and relocated dozens of threatened families. Safe houses, sympathetic officials, routes to sanctuary in Mexico or Canada where federal authority couldn't reach. The last entry, dated just days before his death, contained coordinates and a simple message. "If something happens to me, Sarah will know what to do. The children deserve better than we've given them." Make it right. He was planning to expose everything, Sarah realized, her voice thick with emotion. That's why they killed him. Little Wolf had been examining another folder, his young face grave beyond his years. There's more, he said, handing her a list of names. Families marked for intervention. Look at the third one down. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. There, in Coldwater's precise handwriting, Whitman Homestead, woman demonstrates unstable behavior, practices pagan rituals, unsuitable for child rearing, recommend immediate assessment for any minor children in residence. They'd been planning to take her own children, the babies she'd lost, the family she'd dreamed of building with Joshua. His investigation had made them targets, and his death had been meant to eliminate the threat while providing convenient access to his property and any future children. He's been watching me for 3 years, Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her. Waiting for me to take in children so he could claim I was unfit and seize them legally. The boys had grown quiet, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Finally, Spirit Walker spoke up, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his 6 years. Papa says it's time to stop running, says the other children can't wait anymore, and the bad man's getting stronger every day he ain't stopped. The boy looked directly at Sarah, his dark eyes reflecting depths of wisdom that should have been impossible. Says you're the one who can make it right, but only if you stop being afraid of what you might lose and start fighting for what you can save. Sarah knelt before Spirit Walker, taking his small hands in hers. You tell Joshua that his widow ain't afraid anymore, and tell him his sons are about to learn what happens when you threaten a Cherokee woman's family. As they prepared to leave the mine with their devastating evidence, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, the broken arrows of her heart finally beginning to mend themselves into weapons. Coldwater had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed Sarah's grief had made her weak, that 3 years of mourning had broken her spirit completely. He was about to learn the difference between a woman who'd given up and a woman who'd simply been waiting for something worth fighting for. The confrontation Sarah had dreaded arrived 2 days early, shattering the fragile peace of her homestead like a gunshot through glass. She'd been hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Little Wolf came running from his lookout post on the mesa ridge, his face flushed with exertion and fear. 6 riders coming fast from the east, he gasped, sliding to a stop beside her. That preacher man's in front, and they got badges flashing in the sun. Sarah's hands stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line. Federal marshals, just as Coldwater had promised, but ahead of schedule, which meant he suspected she might be preparing resistance. Get your brothers to the cave, she ordered, her voice calm despite the ice forming in her veins. Take the evidence we found and the rifle. Don't come out no matter what you hear. We ain't leaving you, Little Wolf protested, his young jaw set with stubborn determination. You are, because that's what family does, protects each other. Sarah gripped his shoulders, looking directly into his defiant eyes. Joshua didn't die so you boys could be dragged off to die in some mine shaft. You run, you hide, and you wait for the signal. What signal? Sarah's smile held no warmth, only the cold promise of a woman pushed beyond her breaking point. You'll know it when you see it. The riders approached in a cloud of dust that seemed to darken the morning sun. Reverend Coldwater rode point on his black gelding, his dark coat immaculate despite the desert heat. Behind him came 5 men wearing federal marshal badges, their faces hard as the granite cliffs surrounding Black Mesa. Sarah stood in her dooryard, hands loose at her sides, watching them approach with the stillness of a predator calculating distances. She'd changed from her work dress into the blue calico Joshua had loved. If she was going to fight the United States government, she'd do it looking like the woman her husband had married rather than the ghost she'd become. Coldwater dismounted with theatrical precision, his pale eyes scanning the homestead for signs of the boys. "Mrs. Whitman, I trust you've given our previous conversation due consideration?" "I have indeed, Reverend," Sarah replied evenly. "Considered it, researched it, and found it wanting in several key areas." The preacher's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'm afraid the time for research has passed. Marshal Davidson here has proper authority to collect the federal wards currently in your illegal custody." A thick-set man with graying whiskers stepped forward, unfolding an official document. "Ma'am, I'm Federal Marshal John Davidson. I have here a writ of seizure for 3 minor children of Indian heritage to be transported to appropriate educational facilities as ordered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Sarah accepted the document, scanning the precise legal language that would destroy her family, but Dr. Henley's careful examination of Coldwater's earlier papers had taught her what to look for. "This authorization number," she said, pointing to a line of text. "It's been altered. The ink's a different shade, and the pen strokes don't match the rest of the document." Marshal Davidson's confidence flickered. "Ma'am, I wouldn't know about such things. I just serve the papers I'm given." "And this signature from Territorial Judge Harrison. Interesting, considering Judge Harrison died of apoplexy 3 weeks ago. I attended his funeral myself." Sarah folded the document carefully, her voice growing stronger with each word. "So either you're serving writs signed by dead men, or someone's been very careless with their forgeries." The marshal's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but Coldwater raised a restraining finger. "Mrs. Whitman, you seem to have developed quite an expertise in legal documentation. Perhaps you've had assistance from questionable sources?" "Perhaps I've had assistance from people who know the difference between lawful authority and criminal conspiracy." Sarah's Cherokee heritage showed in the proud straightening of her spine. "Tell me, Reverend, how many children have you shipped to their deaths in your educational facilities?" The mask of religious benevolence finally slipped from Coldwater's features, revealing the predator beneath. "Careful, woman. You're walking very close to accusations that could see you hanged for sedition." "Sedition?" Sarah laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "That's what you call exposing child slavery now." "Interesting interpretation of patriotic duty." "Where are the children?" Marshal Davidson interrupted, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "The writ requires immediate transfer of custody. The children are where they belong, with family who loves them." Sarah's hand moved casually to the pocket of her dress, where Joshua's derringer rested against her hip. "And they'll stay there until you present legitimate, unforged documentation from living federal officials." One of the younger marshals, barely out of his teens, shifted nervously in his saddle. "Marshal Davidson, sir, if there's questions about the paperwork—" "There are no questions," Coldwater snapped, his composure cracking further. "These are federal wards being harbored illegally by a woman of questionable mental stability who practices pagan rituals and claims to commune with the dead." "I talked to my husband's grave, same as any Christian widow," Sarah replied. "Though I suspect you know more about Joshua's death than you've let on." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Coldwater's pale eyes narrowed to slits, and for a moment, Sarah saw the killer who'd ordered her husband's murder. "Mrs. Whitman," he said softly, "you're making accusations that could have serious consequences. Perhaps grief has affected your judgment more severely than we realized." "Perhaps grief has cleared my judgment better than you hoped." Sarah took a step forward, her voice carrying the authority of righteous anger. "I know about the mines, Coldwater. I know about the children who disappear into your educational system and never come out. I know about the profits you split with corrupt officials and the families you destroy for money." Marshal Davidson's face had gone pale. "Ma'am, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you examine those authorization papers more carefully, Marshal." I'm suggesting you ask why a man of God needs 5 armed men to collect 3 small children, and I'm suggesting you consider whether following illegal orders makes you an accessory to kidnapping and murder." The young marshal who'd spoken earlier nudged his horse forward. "Sir, maybe we should verify these documents with the territorial office before—" "You'll follow orders as given," Coldwater snarled, abandoning all pretense of ministerial gentleness. "These children are government property, and this woman is interfering with federal business." "Government property?" Sarah's voice rose to carry across the desert, knowing Little Wolf and his brothers could hear every word from their hiding place. "Did you hear that, Marshal Davidson? The good Reverend just called children government property. Is that the kind of Christianity the Bureau of Indian Affairs endorses now?" The marshal was sweating despite the morning coolness, clearly recognizing that he'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple custody transfer. "Reverend, perhaps we should—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A line of riders appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun like something from a frontier legend. Maria Santos rode point, her weathered face set with grim determination. Behind her came Wong Wei, Tom Yazzie, and a dozen other Black Mesa residents who decided that some things mattered more than avoiding trouble with federal authorities. Dr. Henley's buggy brought up the rear, the old German's medical bag bouncing on the seat beside him as he struggled to keep pace with the younger riders. "Well," Coldwater murmured, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. "It seems you've been busier than anticipated, Mrs. Whitman." The townspeople formed a loose semicircle around the federal marshals, their faces reflecting a mix of determination and fear. These weren't gunfighters or professional revolutionaries, just ordinary people who'd decided that watching children disappear into government custody had become intolerable. Tom Yazzie spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of generations who'd watched their children marched away to distant schools. "Marshal, my grandfather was forced to watch his sons taken to Carlisle 40 years ago. 2 of them died there. 1 came home broken, and 1 never came home at all. I won't watch it happen again." Maria Santos urged her horse forward, her English heavily accented, but her meaning crystal clear. "These boys, they are part of our community now. You want to take them? You explain to all of us why government knows better than family who loves them." "This is federal business," Marshal Davidson protested, but his authority was crumbling in the face of unified community resistance. "You people are interfering with lawful orders." Dr. Henley climbed down from his buggy with deliberate slowness, adjusting his spectacles as he approached the group. "Marshal, perhaps before we discuss the legality of your orders, we should examine their authenticity." He produced a leather portfolio from his medical bag. "I've taken the liberty of corresponding with the actual Bureau of Indian Affairs regarding their policies for child placement." The old German's voice carried the precision of a man accustomed to giving expert testimony. "According to Assistant Commissioner Morgan's office, no federal authority exists for the removal of legally adopted children from appropriate guardians without due process. Furthermore, the authorization numbers on your documentation don't match any current federal formats." Coldwater's mask of control finally shattered completely. "Enough!" he roared, his hand moving to the revolver beneath his coat. "These children are coming with us now, and anyone who interferes will be shot for resisting federal authorities." The morning exploded into chaos as weapons appeared on all sides. Sarah's derringer materialized in her hand with smooth efficiency, aimed directly at Coldwater's chest. Around the homestead, the townspeople drew guns, knives, and farming tools, transforming from peaceful citizens into a determined militia in the space of a heartbeat. "Federal authorities don't threaten to murder citizens for asking questions," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But child traffickers do." Marshal Davidson raised both hands, his face reflecting the dawning realization that he'd been manipulated into participating in something far beyond his authority. "Stand down, everyone. There's been a misunderstanding here." "No misunderstanding," Coldwater snarled, his revolver clearing leather. "These people are harboring federal property and resisting lawful seizure. They're all criminals now." The shot that rang out across the desert didn't come from Coldwater's gun or Sarah's Derringer. Instead, it came from the mesa ridge where Little Wolf stood with Joshua's rifle, the bullet kicking up dust inches from the false preacher's feet. "Next one goes through your black heart," the boy called down, his young voice carrying across the valley with deadly promise. "These are my brothers, this is my mother, and this is our home." "You ain't taking nothing from us." Running Bear and Spirit Walker appeared on rocks flanking the first position, both armed with weapons they'd learned to use during their weeks of freedom. The tactical positioning was perfect: high ground, crossfire angles, and the psychological impact of children willing to fight for their family. "You taught them well," Coldwater said to Sarah, genuine respect mixing with hatred in his voice. "But 3 children with hunting rifles won't stop federal justice." "Maybe not," Sarah replied, her Derringer never wavering from its target. "But 3 children with hunting rifles supported by an armed community that's tired of watching babies disappear might be a different story entirely." Spirit Walker's clear young voice carried down from the heights. "Papa says to tell the black coat man his time's up. Says the children he killed are waiting for him on the other side, and they ain't planning no forgiveness." For the first time since his arrival, Coldwater looked genuinely shaken. Whether he believed in spirits or simply recognized the power of community mythology, the boy's words had found their mark. The standoff stretched across the desert morning like a held breath. Armed citizens facing federal marshals, while 3 orphaned children held the high ground and a Cherokee widow stood ready to die rather than surrender her family. In the distance, more dust clouds appeared on the horizon, reinforcements coming for one side or the other, though whether they represented salvation or damnation remained to be seen. The dust clouds on the horizon resolved into a nightmare that made Sarah's blood turn to ice water. 20 more riders approached at full gallop, their dark clothing and military precision marking them as Coldwater's reinforcements rather than rescue for the townspeople. At their head rode a man Sarah recognized from Joshua's hidden photographs: Captain Marcus Thorne, the corrupt federal official who'd been signing forged documents and splitting profits from the child trafficking operation. "Your cavalry has arrived, Reverend," Captain Thorne called out as his men surrounded the homestead with practiced efficiency. "Though it appears you've allowed this situation to deteriorate beyond acceptable parameters." The townspeople of Black Mesa found themselves outnumbered 3-1, their hunting rifles and farm tools suddenly seeming pathetically inadequate against military carbines and professional gunfighters. Several of the older men began backing their horses away, the weight of federal authority and superior firepower overwhelming their courage. "Maria, take your children and go," Sarah called out desperately. "This isn't your fight anymore." But the Mexican widow shook her head with fierce determination. "See, it is our fight. When they come for children in the night, it is everyone's fight." Captain Thorne dismounted with casual arrogance, his pale eyes scanning the defensive positions with professional assessment. "Mrs. Whitman, I believe? Your late husband caused us considerable inconvenience before his unfortunate accident. I trust you'll prove more reasonable than he was." The casual admission of Joshua's murder hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain steady. "Reasonable? You mean willing to let you steal children for your slave labor camps? I mean willing to acknowledge federal authority and surrender property that belongs to the United States government." Thorne's voice carried the cold certainty of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "These 3 Indian children are wards of the state, and you are in violation of numerous federal statutes by harboring them." Dr. Henley stepped forward, his German accent thick with controlled anger. "Captain, I have here correspondence from the actual Bureau of Indian Affairs stating that no such authorization exists. Your documents are forgeries, and your authority is fraudulent. Captain Thorne barely glanced at the papers Henley offered. Documents can be altered, Dr. Henley. Authority comes from the barrels of guns, and I have more of both than you do. The brutal honesty of the statement sent a chill through the assembled townspeople. This wasn't about law or justice anymore, it was about power, and the captain held all the cards. From the Mesa Ridge, Little Wolf's voice rang out with desperate bravery. "We ain't going nowhere. You want us? Come and take us." "Oh, we will," Captain Thorne replied pleasantly. "But first, we're going to provide Mrs. Whitman with proper motivation for cooperation." He gestured to his men. "Burn the house, shoot the livestock, show these people the cost of defying federal authority." The next few minutes unfolded like scenes from hell itself. Thorne's men moved with military precision, torching Sarah's carefully tended vegetable garden and setting fire to the small barn where Joshua had stored his tools. The chickens Sarah had raised from chicks scattered in panic before being shot down like targets in a cruel game. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, watching 3 years of rebuilding her life go up in flames. "Please, just stop." "The burning stops when you call those boys down from the rocks," Captain Thorne said calmly. "Every minute you delay costs you something else you can't replace." One of his men emerged from the house carrying Joshua's photographs and letters, the precious memories Sarah had treasured since his death. Without ceremony, he threw them into the flames consuming the barn, and Sarah watched her husband's smile curl and blacken in the desert heat. "You monsters," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as everything she'd built with Joshua turned to ash and smoke. Wang Wei tried to urge his horse forward, his normally passive demeanor replaced by rage. "This is not law. This is barbarism." Captain Thorne's answer came in the form of a bullet that whistled past the Chinese merchant's ear. "The next one won't miss, Chinaman." This is how law works in the territories. Federal authority is whatever federal representatives say it is. The psychological warfare was working. Sarah could see the fight draining out of her allies as they watched the casual destruction of her property and the military precision of Thorne's men. These weren't bureaucrats following regulations. They were professional killers operating under the cover of government authority. Spirit Walker's young voice carried down from the heights, cracking with emotion. "Mama, Sarah, don't let them take us. Please don't let them take us." The heartbreak in that cry nearly shattered Sarah's resolve completely. She'd promised these boys safety, family, love, and now she was watching it all burn while armed men prepared to drag them away to die in some distant mine shaft. "Time's up, Mrs. Whitman," Captain Thorne announced. "Call them down now or we start shooting your friends one by one until you do." To emphasize his point, he drew his sidearm and aimed it directly at Maria Santos. The Mexican widow straightened in her saddle, refusing to show fear even as death stared her in the face. "Maria, no!" Sarah gasped, her derringer wavering as she tried to cover both Coldwater and Thorne simultaneously. "Choose quickly," Thorne continued. "The woman dies in 10 seconds, then the German, then the Chinaman. Your heroic resistance isn't worth their lives, and we both know it." The count began with mechanical precision. 10, 9, 8. Sarah's world narrowed to impossible choices. Let Maria die to protect her boys, or surrender the children to certain death in Coldwater's labor camps. Watch her friends murdered one by one, or hand over the family she'd fought so hard to build. 7, 6, 5. From the Mesa Ridge came the sound of rifles being cocked as the boys prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender. But what could 3 children with hunting rifles do against 20 professional gunmen? 4, 3, 2. "Wait!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking with anguish. "Don't shoot her! I'll call them down!" Captain Thorne's smile was colder than winter wind. "Excellent choice, Mrs. Whitman, though I'm afraid your cooperation comes too late to save your property. Consider it a lesson in the cost of defying federal authority." As smoke rose from her burning home and the bodies of her slaughtered chickens littered the yard like broken dreams, Sarah felt something die inside her chest. The hope Joshua had kindled, the family she'd dared to love, the future she'd imagined, all of it turning to ash in the desert heat. But just as she opened her mouth to call her boys down to their doom, the sound of galloping horses thundered across the valley from the west. A new group of riders approached at breakneck speed, their dust cloud mixing with the smoke from Sarah's burning homestead. At their head rode Sheriff Wade, his badge glinting in the morning sun and his face set with grim determination. Behind him came 24 armed men from the surrounding ranches and mining camps, hard men who'd had their own encounters with corrupt federal officials and weren't inclined to stand by while neighbors were terrorized. "Captain Thorne!" Sheriff Wade's voice carried the authority of local law facing down federal tyranny. "You're under arrest for arson, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping." The tide of battle had turned once again, but Sarah knew with sick certainty that more blood would flow before this day ended. Too many guns, too much hatred, too many people pushed beyond their breaking point, and somewhere in the smoke and chaos, 3 small boys clung to rocks and rifles, preparing to fight for the only family they'd ever known. The gunfight that erupted across Sarah's homestead lasted only minutes, but felt like hours of pure hell. Sheriff Wade's arrival had evened the odds, but Captain Thorne's men were professional killers while the ranchers and townspeople were farmers and merchants pressed into service by conscience rather than training. The first volley claimed 3 lives, 2 of Thorne's men and young Pete Morrison from the general store, who'd barely turned 18 and still believed in justice over power. Sarah watched the boy fall with a bullet through his chest, his blood soaking into the desert sand where her vegetable garden had flourished just hours before. "Take cover!" Sheriff Wade roared, diving behind Sarah's overturned wagon as bullets whined through the air like deadly hornets. "Protect the high ground! Don't let them get to the boys!" But Captain Thorne had anticipated this possibility. Even as his main force engaged Wade's men in the yard, a smaller group had circled wide to approach the mesa from the blind side. Sarah saw them scaling the rocks below Little Wolf's position and screamed a warning that was lost in the thunder of gunfire. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Henley took a bullet through the shoulder while trying to reach wounded Pete Morrison, his medical bag spilling bandages and laudanum across the blood-soaked earth. Wang Wei's horse screamed and went down, pinning the Chinese merchant beneath its thrashing body. Maria Santos fought with the fury of a mother protecting cubs, her late husband's cavalry pistol bucking in her weathered hands as she sent Thorne's men diving for cover. From the mesa heights came the crack of hunting rifles as the boys engaged their attackers. Little Wolf's voice carried over the chaos. "They're behind us." "Running Bear, watch the north face." Sarah's heart nearly stopped as she realized the boys were being flanked. Thorne's pincer movement would trap them on the high ground with nowhere to retreat, turning their tactical advantage into a death trap. "I have to get to them," she gasped, reloading her Derringer with hands that shook from adrenaline and terror. "You'll die before you make 10 yards, Sheriff Wade shouted back, blood streaming from a graze across his temple. "That mesa's a killing field now." But Sarah wasn't listening. These boys had become her sons in every way that mattered, and no mother could stand by while her children faced death alone. Clutching Joshua's Derringer, she broke from cover and ran toward the base of the mesa, zigzagging between rocks as bullets kicked up spurts of dust around her feet. Captain Thorne's cold laugh cut through the gunfire. "Let her go. The woman's walking into a trap anyway." "My men will take the children alive or dead. Makes no difference to the profit margins." The casual mention of profit while bullets flew and people died crystallized everything Sarah had learned about this conspiracy. These weren't misguided officials enforcing harsh but necessary laws. They were predators who'd turned child trafficking into a business model, with government authority providing perfect cover for their crimes. Sarah reached the mesa's base just as the flanking attack reached the boys' position. The sound of combat echoed from above. Rifle shots, shouted warnings, the crash of bodies against stone. Little Wolf's voice rose above the din, no longer the careful tones of a boy trying to be older than his years, but the raw scream of a child fighting for his life. The path up the mesa face was treacherous under the best circumstances, loose shale, narrow ledges, handholds that crumbled under pressure. With bullets whining overhead and the sounds of battle growing closer, it became a nightmare of desperation and pure will. Halfway up, Sarah encountered one of Thorne's men descending with Spirit Walker thrown over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The 6-year-old was unconscious, blood matting his dark hair, his small body limp as a broken doll. "Going somewhere, lady?" The man grinned, showing teeth stained with tobacco and malice. "Captain wants to have a word with you about interfering with federal business." Sarah's derringer spoke before her mind fully processed the decision. The .41 caliber bullet took the man's center chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. Spirit Walker's unconscious form rolled free, and Sarah caught him against her body, checking frantically for the pulse that would tell her he still lived. Weak but steady, the boy lived, though a lump on his skull suggested a severe blow. Sarah's relief lasted only seconds before more gunfire erupted from above, followed by Running Bear's anguished cry, "Little Wolf, don't you die on me!" Carrying Spirit Walker's dead weight, Sarah continued her desperate climb toward the sound of her family's destruction. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation she knew might end with all of them dead, but the alternative, abandoning the boys to Coldwater's tender mercies, was unthinkable. She reached the summit to find a scene from a nightmare. Little Wolf lay pinned beneath a fallen attacker, his shirt soaked with blood from a knife wound across his ribs. Running Bear knelt beside him, trying to staunch the bleeding with torn fabric while keeping watch for more enemies. 3 of Thorne's men lay dead around their position, testament to the boy's desperate courage and Little Wolf's deadly accuracy with Joshua's rifle. "Mama Sarah!" Running Bear sobbed when he saw her approach. "He won't wake up, and I can't stop the bleeding." Sarah set Spirit Walker gently against a boulder and moved to examine Little Wolf's injuries. The knife wound was deep but had missed vital organs. He'd live if they could get him proper medical attention, but first they had to survive the next few minutes. "Running Bear, can you carry Spirit Walker?" she asked, checking the loads in Little Wolf's rifle. "Yes, ma'am. But where are we going? They got men all around the base of the mesa now." Sarah looked out over the valley where the gunfight continued to rage. Sheriff Wade's position was being overrun, and Dr. Henley lay motionless beside his overturned buggy. The forces of law and justice were losing to superior firepower and professional ruthlessness. Then her eyes fell on something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The old mine shaft Joshua had shown her years ago, the one with the hidden entrance that led to the network of tunnels honeycombing the mesa. If they could reach it, they might be able to escape underground while their enemies searched the surface. "There's another way down," she told Running Bear, gathering Spirit Walker into her arms. "Help me get Little Wolf up. We're going into the mountain." The descent into Joshua's secret mine took every ounce of courage Sarah possessed. The shaft was narrow, dark, and filled with the sound of dripping water that echoed like distant gunshots. Little Wolf drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling fevered words about protecting his brothers and keeping the family together. Spirit Walker had awakened during the journey but remained silent, his dark eyes reflecting trauma too deep for tears. Only Running Bear maintained his composure, supporting Little Wolf's weight and guiding them through passages he'd explored during their weeks of freedom. "There," Running Bear whispered, pointing to a circle of light ahead. "That's the exit near the creek. We can get to Doc Henley's place from there." But as they emerged into daylight, Sarah's hopes crumbled like desert stone. Captain Thorne stood waiting with a dozen armed men, his cold smile reflecting the satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully driven his prey into a trap. "Mrs. Whitman," he said pleasantly, "how good of you to gather the children in one convenient location. It saves us the trouble of hunting them down individually." Behind him, Reverend Coldwater emerged from the shadows like a vulture attracted by carrion. His pristine black coat remained immaculate despite the morning's violence, and his pale eyes held the satisfied gleam of a man whose long-term planning had finally paid dividends. "You've caused us considerable expense and inconvenience," Coldwater said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of absolute power. "But all rebellions end the same way, with the rebels learning the true cost of defying legitimate authority." Sarah clutched her boys closer, feeling the weight of inevitable defeat crushing down like a collapsed mine shaft. They were surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. The sounds of battle from the homestead had faded to ominous silence, suggesting that Sheriff Wade's rescue attempt had failed completely. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Simple," Captain Thorne replied. "The children come with us. You disappear permanently, unfortunate casualty of your own violent resistance to federal authority. Your friends in town learn the lesson about interfering with government business. Everyone wins except the people foolish enough to believe that individual conscience matters more than institutional power." Little Wolf stirred in her arms, his young voice weak but defiant. "We ain't going nowhere with you. We'd rather die as family than live as slaves." Captain Thorne's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Death can certainly be arranged, boy, though Reverend Coldwater prefers his workers alive, at least initially." The moment stretched like a held breath, armed men surrounding a desperate woman and 3 wounded children with nowhere left to run. Sarah found herself thinking of Joshua, wondering if his spirit could see how his final mission had ended in failure and blood. Then Spirit Walker's small voice cut through the desert air like a blade. "Papa says to tell you the real federal marshal's coming. Says you got about 2 minutes to start running if you want to live." Captain Thorne's confident expression flickered, and in that moment of uncertainty, Sarah heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of the territorial capital. The sound grew louder, more distinct, carrying with it the possibility of salvation or the certainty of doom. But for the first time since the nightmare began, Sarah dared to hope that Joshua's spirit might have one final surprise for the men who destroyed his family. The riders who crested the ridge came like an answer to prayers Sarah hadn't dared voice. At their head rode a tall man in a pristine blue uniform, his silver badge catching the morning sun with the unmistakable authority of genuine federal power. Behind him followed 20 United States cavalry troopers, their Springfield rifles gleaming, and their faces set with the grim purpose of soldiers who'd ridden hard through the night. "This is Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Harrison," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying across the desert with parade ground precision. "By order of Territorial Governor Bradford and the Department of Justice, all persons involved in this incident will cease hostile action immediately and submit to federal investigation." Captain Thorne's face went ashen as he recognized the name. Thomas Harrison was the nephew of the territorial judge whose signature had been forged on the custody documents. And more importantly, he was one of the few federal officials whose integrity couldn't be purchased with railroad gold or Coldwater's blood money. "Marshal Harrison," Thorne said, his voice carefully controlled despite the sweat beading on his forehead, We're conducting a lawful operation under federal authority. These people have been harboring government wards illegally and resisting federal seizure with armed force." Marshal Harrison dismounted with deliberate slowness, his pale eyes scanning the scene with professional assessment. Sarah noticed that his gaze lingered on the bodies scattered around the mesa base, the smoke still rising from her burned homestead, and the blood staining the desert sand where good people had died for the crime of protecting children. "Interesting definition of lawful operation, Captain," Harrison replied, his tone carrying the deadly courtesy of a man unimpressed by military rank. "Tell me, under whose authority did you burn civilian property and engage in armed combat with territorial citizens?" "Under authority properly delegated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the collection of displaced Indian miners," Thorne answered, producing the forged documents with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Marshal Harrison accepted the papers and examined them with the careful attention of a man who'd spent years dealing with fraudulent documents. His expression grew colder with each line he read. "Captain Thorne," he said finally, "these authorizations bear the signature of my uncle, Judge Marcus Harrison. Perhaps you weren't aware that Judge Harrison died 3 weeks ago of apoplexy. I attended his funeral myself." The silence that followed was profound as a grave. Even Reverend Coldwater's mask of religious authority couldn't hide the recognition that their elaborate deception had finally been exposed by someone with both the power and the integrity to act on the truth. "Furthermore," Marshal Harrison continued, "I have here a sworn statement from Assistant Commissioner Morgan of the actual Bureau of Indian Affairs specifically disavowing any knowledge of operations to remove legally adopted children from appropriate guardians. Would you care to explain how you came by authority that the Bureau itself denies issuing?" Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief so profound it was almost painful. After months of feeling helpless against the weight of federal authority, here was a genuine representative of justice who'd seen through Coldwater's web of lies and forgeries. Spirit Walker stirred in her arms, his dark eyes focusing with the peculiar intensity that always preceded his most unsettling observations. "Papa says the black coat man's going to try to run now. Says to watch his left hand." The warning came just as Coldwater's arm moved toward the concealed weapon beneath his ministerial robes. But little Wolf, despite his injuries, had been watching with the predatory awareness of a boy who'd learned that survival depended on reading threats before they materialized. "Gun!" he shouted, and chaos erupted once again across the desert. Coldwater's Derringer cleared leather just as Marshal Harrison's Colt appeared in his hand with the fluid precision of professional gunfighter. The two weapons fired simultaneously, but the federal marshal's superior training and equipment told the story. Coldwater spun backward with a .45 caliber bullet through his chest, his own shot going wide to ricochet harmlessly off the mesa's stone face. Captain Thorne made his own desperate play for freedom, drawing on the nearest cavalry trooper while his surviving men scattered like startled quail. But the soldiers had been expecting treachery, and their disciplined volley cut down 3 of Thorne's gunmen before they could clear leather. The captain himself took 2 bullets, one through the shoulder, another through the thigh, and collapsed against a boulder with blood pooling beneath him. "Secure the survivors," Marshal Harrison ordered his men, "and get a medic to check on the wounded civilians. I want statements from everyone who's still breathing." As the cavalry troopers moved to carry out their orders, Sarah found herself finally able to breathe freely for the first time in weeks. The nightmare was over. Her boys were safe. The men who'd killed Joshua and terrorized countless families would face justice. But the cost had been terrible. Young Pete Morrison lay dead in the dust where he'd fallen, defending people he'd barely known. Dr. Henley's shoulder would never fully heal, and the gentle German's faith in American justice had been shattered along with his bones. 3 ranchers who'd answered Sheriff Wade's call lay still beneath the desert sun, their families now facing the same uncertain future Sarah had known for 3 years. "Ma'am?" Marshal Harrison approached her with the careful respect due to someone who'd endured more than any person should have to bear. "I'm going to need a full statement about everything that's happened here, but first, let's get those boys to a doctor." Sarah looked down at Little Wolf, whose breathing had grown shallow and whose face had taken on the waxy pallor that preceded shock. Running Bear clung to his wounded brother with fierce protectiveness, while Spirit Walker remained silent and wide-eyed in her arms. "There's no doctor left," she said quietly. "Doctor Henley's hurt bad, and he was the only medical man within 50 miles. "Actually, ma'am," one of the cavalry troopers interjected, "we brought an army surgeon with us from Santa Fe. Captain Morrison's got experience with battlefield wounds." The irony of the name wasn't lost on Sarah. Another Morrison, come to help heal the damage caused by men who shared nothing with young Pete except a surname and a commitment to justice. As the army surgeon worked to stabilize Little Wolf's condition and examine Spirit Walker's head injury, Marshal Harrison interviewed the survivors with methodical thoroughness. The story that emerged was even worse than Sarah had imagined. A network of corruption reaching from local territorial officials all the way to certain members of Congress who'd been profiting from the systematic exploitation of Native American children. "Mrs. Whitman," the marshal said when he'd finished taking statements, "I want you to know that this investigation is going to reach some very powerful people. There may be attempts at intimidation, bribery, or worse." "Are you prepared for that kind of attention?" Sarah looked at her boys. Little Wolf unconscious but stable, Running Bear exhausted but defiant, Spirit Walker finally sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to stand against impossible odds. "Marshal, these men killed my husband and tried to steal my children. They murdered babies for profit and called it government policy. If you think threats are going to make me back down now, you don't understand what it means to be Cherokee." Harrison smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since arriving. "Ma'am, I think I'm beginning to understand exactly what it means. And I think the people responsible for this conspiracy are going to learn more about Cherokee determination than they ever wanted to know." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sarah sat beside Little Wolf's makeshift stretcher and watched the cavalry troopers prepare for their return journey to Santa Fe. Captain Thorne and the surviving members of his conspiracy would face federal charges, while Reverend Coldwater's body would be shipped back to whatever eastern city had spawned such perfect evil. The burned ruins of her homestead stood as testimony to the price of resistance, but Sarah found herself thinking not of what had been destroyed, but of what had been preserved. Her family remained intact. The truth had finally been exposed, and somewhere in the desert wind she imagined she could hear Joshua's voice whispering words of pride and love. "Mama Sarah?" Running Bear's voice interrupted her thoughts. "What happens now?" "Do we get to stay together?" Sarah reached out to touch his hair, marveling again at the courage these boys had shown in the face of overwhelming odds. "We stay together," she said firmly. "We rebuild what was burned, we heal what was hurt, and we make sure this never happens to another family." Spirit Walker opened his eyes at the sound of her voice, his dark gaze focusing with unusual clarity. "Papa says to tell you the hard part's over now. Says the arrows in your heart aren't broken anymore. They're pointing toward home." As the boy spoke, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the grief that had defined her existence for 3 years, a recognition that love didn't die with the beloved but transformed into something stronger and more enduring. The sun set over Black Mesa that evening with the promise of a new day coming, and for the first time since Joshua's death, Sarah Broken Arrow believed in tomorrow. At 68, Sarah had learned that true family isn't born from blood. It's forged in the fires of shared struggle and unconditional love. As she watched her three sons, now grown men with families of their own, gather around her kitchen table for Sunday dinner, she marveled at how broken hearts could heal stronger than before. Little Wolf had become a teacher, Running Bear, a renowned artist whose carvings graced museums across the territory, and Spirit Walker, a gentle minister who helped other lost souls find their way home. The homestead they'd rebuilt together stood as testament to a profound truth many discover too late in life. Our greatest joy often comes not from what we're given, but from what we choose to give. Sarah's Cherokee grandmother once said, "Empty nests become full hearts when we open our doors to love." In a world that often leaves seniors feeling invisible and forgotten, Sarah's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters can begin when others think our story is ending. Sometimes the family we need most finds us when we're brave enough to say yes to unexpected love, even when our hearts feel too broken to try again. What unexpected blessing came into your life when you thought your story was over? Have you ever found family in the most unlikely places? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how love found you when you needed it most.